Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Monday, February 24th, 2025. It's day 507. In terms of the ceasefire agreement, people living in Gaza are afraid that the war is about to begin again. And so they've returned, many of them, to what's left of their homes in the north of the Gaza Strip. And Israel has begun to besiege the north of the occupied West Bank. And Al Jazeera English, the very first article, if you looked late this evening on Al Jazeera English, it says, fears of return of all-out war has begun, as what was called the silent war in the occupied West Bank has continued. On Saturday over the weekend, Israel withheld and delayed the release of 620 prisoners, Palestinian prisoners that were planned in exchange for not 3 Israeli hostages, but 6. Hamas wanted to show that they were serious and eager to move into phase 2. It was supposed to start several weeks ago. As of yet, it still has not begun. The release of further hostages has been assured, was what Hamas said they were trying to communicate. But the release of the hostages was in humiliating ceremonies. That's also a direct quote from Prime Minister Netanyahu. So 6 hostages released on Saturday, which Israel said was a clear violation of the terms of the ceasefire agreement. Thus, the 600 plus Palestinian prisoners were not released. It's been 72 hours, and there's almost nothing in international news sources or US news sources about these 600 plus Palestinian prisoners. Now, about 100 of them have either life sentences or very, very long sentences. Of the 500 other prisoners, many of them were just swept up in Gaza. Now, many young men were presumed to be members of Hamas just because they were young men living in Gaza. And I can barely find any information about what's going on in that regard. And I think about how if this were any other scenario or any other alternative party who had violated a ceasefire agreement, how much we'd be hearing about it in the news. It's just astounding to me. The only news I could receive about phase 1 of the ceasefire deal, other than the very, very detailed reports that I will spare you about in some of my private communications with contacts behind the scenes, are obscure reports. I did read that Hamas may release 2 deceased Israeli hostages, bodies in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners, whose release was delayed on Saturday. That was in a London-based newspaper, Asharq al-Awsat. I did not check Hebrew papers or Arab sources. Okay, in the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, on Sunday morning, it was announced via private security channels that West Bank attacks by settlers occurred. Settlers stole 800 sheep from Palestinians and water tanks in a town called Deir Bawan. Settler attacks on Palestinian Bedouin communities, and they also burned property in the plains of a town called Jabba, which is east of Jerusalem. Israeli forces also expelled the residents in Jenin, members of the communities of Tulkarm and Nershan's refugee camps. That was actually said by the defense minister Katz. The empty camps would be occupied by the Israeli military for the coming year, quote, to prevent the return of residents and resurgence of terrorism, end quote. With tanks deployed in the West Bank, listen to this. I just want you to know that this is happening and we're not hearing about it in the news. For the first time in 20 years, there are tanks right now in the West Bank. For the first time in 20 years, there are tanks right now in the West Bank, this particular type of tank. For the first time in 20 years, I'm like, and it's not even in the news. The West Bank right now is at war, and we're not even hearing about it. Israeli forces arrested 2 Palestinian suspects in an attack that wounded 2 Israelis in the West Bank village of Deir Bawan, as well as 6 suspects in Jenin and Kafin, and seized weapons. Israel has a legitimate security threat. This is actually true. And Palestinians who are not a part of violent resistance are being displaced by the tens of thousands. More than 40,000 Palestinians in the West Bank have been displaced. This is the greatest displacement of Palestinians since 1967. Friends, the situation is getting worse and worse, and the Gaza war may start back up again. Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. I did not read this in the news, but I got this from direct reports on the ground. Tulkarm today, nearly 100 homes were destroyed in the Tulkarm camp. I did also read West Bank workers were deported to the Gaza Strip. So people who live in the West Bank who were working in Israel did not have permits to work in Israel. And instead of being deported back to where they're from, they were deported into Gaza, which means they can't go home to the West Bank. Now, Israel denied this vehemently. What I just described is literally the definition of ethnic cleansing. Although Israel denied the claims and said it's fake news, I do not have verification of that. I'm just reporting that it has been communicated. 40 right-wing activists, 125 border guard soldiers, 12 members of Israeli intelligence stormed the courtyards of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound this morning during morning incursions. In Israel, a 20-year-old resident of the central Israeli Arab city of Tayyibeh, who published social media posts in praise of the October 7th attacks, was sentenced to 27 months in prison for incitement of terrorism. Now, there have been many cases about that, and it's very important to read the specifics. I just want you to know, there was a teacher who posted a video, and the video was recorded well before October 7th, and then that video was used to say that it was celebrating the October 7th attacks. I don't know that that's the specific case, but and there are people who praise the October 7th attacks, so I'm not denying that. But the specifics, which I don't have in this case, are very, very important. Israel denied the entry of European Parliament member Rima Hassan into the country at the recommendation of Diaspora Affairs for combating anti-Semitism. Israeli security forces are searching the area on the border of Jordan to rule out possible infiltration. Our relation should not be held hostage by the bitter conflict with our Palestinian neighbors, said Sahar, the foreign minister, to EU foreign ministers at the EU-Israel Association Council, which included 20 countries. It was convened in Brussels for the first time since 2012. That was 80 years after the Holocaust, a huge wave of anti-Semitism, especially on European soil. Europe has a responsibility to deal with this, Sahar said. He also claimed Jews in America on college campuses feel safer now that Trump is president. In Gaza, a rocket was launched from Gaza and landed in the Gaza Strip. The IDF reported that the launch site and an additional launch site in the area were attacked in response. There's a lot of discussion in the press about statements that a leading Hamas official made saying he would have opposed the October 7th attacks if he'd known about the repercussions on Gaza. The leader was Musa Abu Marzouk. He later said that those comments were taken out of context, where he said, he attempted to make clear our people, meaning the Palestinian people's right to resistance in all forms. He went into great detail later about what that meant. Liberation and return headed by armed resistance. In Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Israel, the ceasefire, of course, has expired. Tens of thousands of mourners yesterday participated in the long-delayed, 5 months delayed public funeral for Hezbollah's former leader, Hassan Nasrallah, who was killed by an Israeli airstrike in September. There were estimates that as many as 1.4 million people might have attended Nasrallah's funeral in Beirut. I believe it was in Beirut, but in Lebanon. Israeli airstrikes struck numerous locations over Lebanon. I don't know if that was yesterday or today, but I had reports of more than half a dozen, if not a dozen, sites that were struck, including Baalbek, Wadi Zakin. I won't go through all of the areas. Christ have mercy. In Syria, National Dialogue Conference, it's set to start February 25th, according to 2 members of the preparatory committee. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the, of course, governing agency. Israel will not tolerate its presence and is calling for disarmament of southern Syria, which I can't imagine that HTS would agree to. But Netanyahu is calling for it to be demilitarized. The U.S. Trump has repealed the Biden directive linking U.S. arms sales to human rights. This was one of the few measures that Biden took to protect any Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. This was the National Security Memorandum 20 that was designed to ensure that U.S. military sales are not complicit in foreign human rights violations. The report said that National Security Advisor Mike Waltz issued a memo earlier this week relaying Trump's decision to rescind the National Security Memorandum. This was Memorandum 20 that Senator Van Hollen of Maryland and many other Democrats worked so hard on. We had so many hopes under Biden that this mechanism would be used legitimately to withhold weapons sales from Israel because they were being used in violation of international law and U.S. laws, for that matter, even as reported on occasion by the U.S. State Department. Trump's pick for the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, is viewed as contentious in a very divided Jewish community. So while efforts are spearheaded by the Reform Movement, the Zionist Organization of America, respectively, there are divisions along partisan lines. There's intense polarization represented by the Trump administration's approach to Israel and the Middle East. Rabbi Jonah Dov Pesner, the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, wrote to all 100 senators on behalf of 850 congregations around America, encompassing 1.8 Reform Jews, as well as the Central Conference of American Rabbis, whose membership includes 2,000 Reform rabbis, opposing Mike Huckabee as the pick for the U.S. ambassador to Israel. White House envoy Steve Witkoff yesterday is traveling to the Middle East on Wednesday to discuss the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire deal possibly being extended. Israel, Qatar, and Egypt will be a part of that conversation. The Trump administration issued a new round of sanctions against Iran, targeting 22 individuals and 13 vessels involved in the illicit oil trade of Iran. The Trump administration yesterday notified 1,600 U.S. agency international development staffers they were fired and told most of its staffers worldwide that they were on administrative leave as of today. That's very, very, very important in terms of the Middle East because U.S. aid is very active all over the Middle East. U.S. aid, for example, the largest recipient, Catholic Relief Services, said that they may have to cut up to 50% of their staff. And they were one of the largest recipients and doing incredible, incredible work in Gaza. And they're also an observer member of Churches for Middle East Peace. A federal judge on Friday ruled the administration of Trump can and now proceed with the move to put thousands of U.S. aid workers on administrative leaves, saying that the plaintiffs have not shown irreparable harm that could justify the grant of an injunction. I just want to sit down and cry. Lord have mercy. Today, I hosted a webinar that included participants of the Holy Land Coordination Committee, which is a group of Catholic bishops that's been going to the Holy Land since the 90s, global bishops from around the world, Catholic bishops. So Bishop Chesson, who's of the Anglican Church of England, Christopher Lundquist of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and Churches for Middle East Peace's Kyle Christopholo were advisor and observer members, were a part of that webinar today. You can watch that on YouTube. That's specifically focused on the Christian community and their trip to Jerusalem in January. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, this is my closing prayer and an encouragement to us. Verses 8 to 12 and 16 to 18. Hear these as a prayer. Over all the things we just heard, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. I think of this about the people being displaced from their homes, the people in Gaza, the people who have been bombed, the people who've lost loved ones, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. We who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may be revealed in our mortal body. So then death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. What is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. So that is the good news for today. What is unseen is eternal. The good news that we have in the love that God has for us and for the world. May God go before us in the name of Christ. Amen.